A pleasure and delight to be here with Rabbi Dr. Goldie Milgram, who is the Executive Director of Reclaiming Judaism, an award-winning educator, author, artist, and storyteller, whose many innovative methods, books, and resources have been honored by the Covenant Foundation and the National Jewish Book Council. You can learn more about her work at reclaimingjudaism.org. Two of her many books include Reclaiming Bar and Bat Mitzvah as a Spiritual Rite of Passage, and Wisdom from Reb Solomon, Embracing the Spirit. Reb Solomon was one of Reb Goldie's teachers and mentors. And we also have a podcast with Reb Goldie tonight that you can listen to on this topic as well. So thank you for taking time to talk.
A pleasure.
So to start off, what was your path towards discovery to this unique field of Jewish spiritual education?
When I look back and I look at the trauma that my family experienced during the war and their parents coming as immigrants and my father being an Allied soldier who was carrying the first portable radar in the war, and then his legs were crushed during the war. And I think that I was looking for a Judaism that would actually be healing, that would connect to spirit, that would enable people to be able to live with greater joy and intimacy and caring. And what I found in a variety of contexts, including I was Jewish Federation Executive Director for a long time,
Oh, wow.
and in that work when I was in Vineland, New Jersey, I was working with many Holocaust survivors and their children. And what I discovered was that there was a disconnect, and that what had happened is Jews had fled to our intellect. And instead of having a physical world and emotional world, intellectual and spiritual, that by being in our intellect, we had the forms of Judaism, we had the structures, but we didn't know how to turn on the lights in the building and have it work on our behalf, and for us to be motivated through the spiritual current, if you want, of the tradition, through what traditionally it might be how one says God spoke, through living a mitzvah-centered rather than a self-centered life, and yet appreciating the mitzvot of self-care at the same time and doing them. By opening up that can and looking for how can I help the people, not realizing it was me too, right? Because wounded healer syndrome. But how can, because I grew up in a very anti-Semitic neighborhood, and I needed to find where is the spirit of Judaism? Where does it affect the life force? How do we live? Why are we here? Who are we? Why are we here after all these thousands of years? What does it mean?
Beautiful. And I love that idea of mitzvah-centered rather than self-centered. I think that's a real challenge today, that we can become so consumed within our own world of gashmiut, of physicality, and our desires. So I think these two barriers we have to get over, that we're in the mind. We are a people, a cognitive, intellectual people, which is a great gift, but also a barriers in ways, and we have a lot of trauma, and there's a lot of healing. And so you're responding to those two. And so what are some of the principles that guide your approach to Jewish spiritual education?
To start with the life of a person and see where they are, to get someone to tell their narrative. Or sometimes I use stories and see where their story rises up in response to the story. It might be a traditional story. It might be, from my travels, a contemporary Jewish story. When I was teaching in Russia and Ukraine for Project Kesher, for example, I was teaching the youth about how the midwives rebelled against the Pharaoh. Well, then, when I went looking for some of my program supplies, I went looking for the kids. I found them defying the Pharaoh of the retreat center, which was an old TB sanatorium. Like we used the Catskill hotels. They use the old TB center, treatment centers, as retreat centers now. And and the children from Chernobyl were there. And we were told we couldn't go near them, we couldn't talk to them, that they were, radioactive and all this kinds of. They were obviously very ill. They were obviously not happy and walking along. But we weren't allowed to deal with them. But I had mothers and daughters that had come to the retreat right after Perestroika with me. The end, when the former Soviet Union ended and it became possible to practice your tradition. Well, after hearing my story about the pharaoh and the midwives, the girls went without me knowing, and they brought the colored feathers I had in our craft closet, and they went to cheer up, to do Bikur Cholim, to visit the sick. And they defied the pharaoh of the retreat center, they said to me, because they knew that that was what a mitzvah was and that they wanted to be like the midwives. So they learned that they had power and that they could do that. And their spiritual approach to those children, the children were laughing and smiling and preening and playing despite the rule that we weren't allowed to be there.
So one core principle then is to connect individual stories with this other stories.
Exactly.
Yeah. What else would you add as a core
So
principle?
you want to take things from the head to the heart into action.
Yes.
I'll give you an example. I was working way up in Canada in Alberta, and there were B'nai Mitzvah students and their parents and their clergy were in the room. And I have a deck of cards where I interpret all of the mitzvot through a spiritual lens, an inclusive, an open, inclusive and spiritual lens. And the students were sorting them and I said to them, if you wanted to pick one mitzvah to spend the next hour with me on, what would you pick? And they pulled out lo tikkun, refrain from holding a grudge. And these 12-year-olds, I said, can you put on a skit about that? Show all of us what happens to you. We began to see what bullying looks like, what the pain of not having a process to work through. Because they said to me, but Rabbi, how do we refrain from holding a grudge? How do you do that? And I began to teach them how to listen in a deep way to each other, how to share their story and be able to experience an aha. One of the students all of a sudden said, it never occurred to me until this minute that the student who's been hurting me, physically was hurting this student, was beaten by his father. And I never had any empathy for the other person. And all of a sudden this spiritual awakening happened that this student could pray for this other student to transform. And so there's a process of the Jewish people being like a support group for each of our spiritual practices. And when we listen deeply to each other's narrative and we support each other without trying to fix it, the awareness that will come will allow healing and the mitzvah can be fulfilled. But otherwise they're carrying this burden and this dislike and this fear. In their school, they're avoiding other students that are,
Right. So it sounds like you're primarily not just talking about meditation 101 or yoga 101, but about life.
About life. That's real. Spirituality is meant to happen in the between. Buber would have said in the between, right? Where what happens to you matters to me. I usually, my luggage got lost, so it's full of books now, but it got lost, and I usually carry a band for the wrist of people that says, Ehyeh imach. And on the other side it says, I will be with you. And then on the inside it says, you are not alone. And either I or one of the older children or another adult will put an email and their name and their phone number, so that if anybody's scared or lost or feeling at risk in the world, that they have someone who's come to them and said, I will be with you. You can reach out to me. To me, that's real spirituality. And then there comes a time when you get that tractor beam of divine love, when you really... You learn how from your depths to be able to call out. I teach them hibodedut. I teach them how to go out into nature and empty, because if the cup of your life is gummed up with what's going on for you, and you don't know that it's a Jewish practice to go out and empty out, because the source can take everything. We're not going to, even if you're angry, it's fine to be angry, but let it out, because you can't refill with spirit.
Beautiful. So I think my last question is, what kind of influence did Reb Solomon have on this thinking for you, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi? Well, how did he influence this path for you?
So I first met Reb Solomon when I was at the Association of Humanistic Psychology, and one of my mentors, Louise Vanetta of blessed memory, said to me, I was 16 and a half, and she said, I'd started college early, and she said, I have to tell you, I met this very cool rabbi, and I think that he has what you've been talking about and looking for. And she said, he's going to be in the swimming pool today, you have to come and meet him. So I go to the swimming pool, and there is what looks like a full-fledged Orthodox rabbi in the pool guiding the conference, in this giant Olympic pool, guiding the conference participants in creating a wave that was going to crest. And he's speaking about fluid kinetics and comparing it to spiritual kinetics in Judaism, and how when you're davening, he was teaching davenology in this way, how when you're davening, what a makubal is, what it is to raise spirit and how to build it in community and understand it. And that, and then years later, my first day of rabbinical school, I'm now post-describal, but at the time I was studying, and I graduated as a rabbi from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and Reb Solomon later also gave me his smicha and things. But the ability to translate what happens when we are engaged in spiritual practices, like things he showed me, and the ways. At the seminar today, I'll show him on video teaching. He was able to take science and religious experience and let them inform each other so that we could understand how the mechanics work, which opened up hearts and lets us benefit from what's possible.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, thank you for taking this time.
You're welcome.
And you can learn more about Reb Goldie's approach to Jewish spiritual education at reclaimingjudaism.org.
Thank you.
Lots of bracha.